Hello, everyone. I'm Henry Neufeld with Energeon Publications, and I'm talking today with Pat Badstibner, who's the president of World Prayer, involved in ministry around the world, talking about the gospel, and that's very much involved with Paul. This is the latest in my series of interviews with people who have some expertise on who was Paul. Where I ask the same set of questions to each person and get their particular perspective. Pat has done a lot of reading, especially of theology and of folks like Martin Luther, so I wouldn't be surprised if we hear about Martin Luther somewhere in this whole thing. So welcome, Pat.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks for the intro. Probably not going to hear too much about Luther because this is about Paul. If I was doing a discussion on the law by itself and the gospel by itself, then we might hear Luther. But thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to the scripted questions now so that we can get your particular view. And the starting point is where we get our information. Which epistles do you regard as Pauline? And particularly, we look at the controversial ones, Ephesians, Colossians, the pastoral epistles, and Hebrews.
Starting out lighter, given the discussion over Hebrews, this could be hotly debated after everything but I believe everything from Romans to Philemon 13 of the 27 New Testament books. And right there is the central character of Acts, along with Peter. Contrary to those who want to credit Paul for Hebrews, I'm just not buying. I'm selling that point. While it has a distinctive Pauline influence, I believe it would be more likely that it was written by someone he mentored.
Okay. So that leads us to question number 2, which is also, as you put it, starting light. How do you evaluate Acts as a historical source when you're answering the question, who is Paul?
Now, this one's a little easier, okay? And probably should have started with this one. Since Paul is one of two central figures, as I just mentioned, in the history of the church, Acts is extremely important in understanding not only Paul's work, but his impact on the early church, the historical context of a lot of what Paul writes. And one of the later questions, I'm going to get into that a little further, along with Paul himself. An example of this was Acts 15, is where we see the triple Paul that he describes in Galatians 2 and 2 Corinthians 11:25. We find Paul saying, I was stoned 3 times, I was shipwrecked, I spent a night and a day in the open sea. Acts 27 through 28 tells us this story.
Okay. So now we know what your sources are using all of the epistles traditionally attributed, except for Hebrews and serious use of Acts. From your reading of Paul, and of course possibly Acts as well, if you were asked to introduce him as the next speaker at a conference, supposing he were here today, what might your introduction be?
Now, you're free to push me on this a little bit if you want to, but I like the story you tell of Harold Weiss's answer on this. And so I'm going to reverberate his statement. Who in the world would invite Paul to a conference? Especially in today's times when shiny and polished is the trend. Churches and conference want shiny teeth, hip-dressed, energetic speakers who move around, provide lots of encouraging, positive, inspiring talk. They want to know how they can be better and perform better. Paul cared little about others knowing he was getting better or others noticing how he was improving. He echoed this when he said in 2 Corinthians 11:29 through 30, who is weak and I not weak? Who is led into sin? And do I not burn with grief over my sin? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and the Father of the Lord Jesus is forever worthy of praise, knows that I am not mine. He continued, echoed his sin. Paul was sarcastic. We find that in Galatians 5:12. And it's a beautiful example of the sarcasticness of Paul when he says, as for those agitators, I wish they would just go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Paul was crude. Those reading his letter in Philippi would have found him crude when he wrote, anything gained for me was dung. We dare not even whisper that word in certain churches that would fit that word dung. In today's times, I think if tomorrow I got up and said an American word, I would surely be counted crude. 2 Corinthians 11:6 tells us that he didn't speak well. And 2 Corinthians 10:10 tells us he wasn't much to look at. Peter even tells us his writing was not all that good. He struggled tremendously with doubt and depression. He could be a bully, short-tempered, and was known to historically chase people out of the room just because he didn't want them there. He was easily agitated and irritated. The beatings he received may have left him more scarred, and he was just might confront one of the conference speakers if they deferred from the gospel in order to tell Christians how to be more moral, as he did in Galatians 2. There would also exist the fear that if he found out that those he was speaking to were as the church of Galatians, he might just call them all stupid and mindless. Nobody wants a conference speaker who you might risk to call the audience attenders empty-headed and stupid fools, as he called the Galatians in chapter 3. Nope, I'll save Harold's statement, who would invite Paul. Becky and I were recently discussing the differences between Paul and John as we discussed the differences between myself and my good friend and Pastor Brian Holder. Brian has the heart of John, tender, relational, and easily connected to. We also noted that Paul could be cold, insensitive, matter of fact, dismiss you, as I already noted, because you irritated him, and a gospel bully at times. You would not want him as your pastor either. Becky and Brian both agreed they would not want yours truly as their pastor or Paul. Someone once said if you look up the term "don't suffer Paul's will," you find Paul's picture. Someone has also said that about me. I'd like to think God softened Paul's heart over time and that there remains hope for me. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, well, I like that detail because that gives some people some personality ideas. Because as you're reading the letters, get you some ideas collecting that information. So I appreciate those references. And so, probably considering those references, we go to the fourth question. And many of the same things probably have a role to play. But if a friend of yours was considering going on a mission trip with Paul, what would your advice be? Go with him, plan a different journey? What?
I saw the ministry's board chair, Jamie Brown, the other day, and I asked him this question. Then I had to think about the answer Jamie gave. Well, Jamie was right that it would depend on whether it was young or old Paul. I think might say it differently. If you were going on a trip with young Paul, you want to make sure you bring your A game. Be ready to be beaten, thrown over walls, not eat right, sleep right, and work day and night. Do not volunteer if you like sleeping till noon. Do not like being overworked, afraid of being stoned, being thrown in jail, or getting malaria. If being around intense people bothers you, you're not going to enjoy going to Paul. You wouldn't have enjoyed Jesus for that much either. Going on a missionary trip with Paul is not for lighthearted, weak-kneed, or feeble-minded. It also isn't for those who get seasick like my wife or who have claustrophobia like me. It is also not for those who do not like cold, dark, wet places. You should know my friend Paul is not one to suffer. Fools, as I already mentioned, are idiots. Has a short temper and will dump you in the middle of nowhere if he thinks you're not made of the right stuff. If you're risk averse, best to take another trip with Barnabas. As long as none of that bothers you, then by all means go. It will be the best trip you've had in your lifetime. As to an older Paul, bring lots of books. He likes to read a lot. And he prepares and be prepared to write a lot because Paul writes a lot, but his eyesight isn't the best, and so he makes others write for him. Be prepared now to experience a lot of moodiness because Paul now is a bit moody.
Okay. Well, now that we've looked at the personality, we're going to just keep moving through the questions. And I think this is probably a more interesting, controversial one. What do you think modern interpreters most commonly misunderstand about Paul?
For me, there could be a laundry list here, and it really gets to the meat of the matter. Most interpreters, I believe, misunderstand that neither Christ nor Paul gave a new law. Having said that, it's also true that Christ said it was a new law I gave you. If the context is wrong, if we think that means we've been given some new law not found before in the Bible, or God forgot it to forgive one, so, oh wait, I forgot to give this, let's make sure we give it. It was new to Christians at the time Christ said that, and it is still new, obviously, by how some teach and act to some today. It is true that we've been called to a law of love, but that was not new. This is the same law that was given in the garden. Just as Paul wasn't the first one to say, be content in all things, nor was he the first to say, work as unto the Lord. He also wasn't the first to say it's not about us or about our personal relationship with Jesus. Paul wasn't the first one to stress the importance of community. God said all these things in the garden. All Paul did was expound on those things, and the Holy Spirit reminded him of what Christ had taught. Thus, to follow me is to follow him. Paul did not define the gospel simply, but began there and expounded. Paul wrote to himself more than anyone as he reminded himself continually of who would rescue the wretched man. That was Paul. Paul also wrote from a continued point of brokenness. Yet today we tend to choose our own folly to ignore Paul's words of brokenness, and that he would boast in his weakness. I once had someone leave the ministry because I was talking too much about our weakness, and that we should live from our weakness. It's a horrible thing in today's times where we want to talk about strength and identity in Christ and church, which is being fed by a secular philosophy of don't focus on your weaknesses, but on your strengths. It's the opposite of what Paul taught. We now try to explain away any such talk of Paul being a sinner or emphasizing his weakness. I recently have encountered this in a very great way as someone who's living under a 10-ton weight of shit hanging over their heads. It has called me everything under the sun, including Satan, because I've talked about the greatness of our sin. When you're someone who is dealing with tremendous shame, the last thing you want to hear is about the greatness of your sin. Especially if all you know of the gospel is how to have your bags packed for a one-way ticket to paradise. And there's only a couple problems with this. It has never been the policy of those who are without Christ to freely admit weakness or their moral failures, or that the law shows them they are sinners. The world has been a place where everyone is in search or trying to prove that they are deserving of love, to be counted capable, worthy, significant. love is your church's chief pursuit, there's no way that you're going to freely admit you're a coveter. In fact, our very defensiveness when someone points out our failures reveals that we don't believe we're loved. The second problem is that the law has three key purposes, and one of those is to reveal our sin. Secondly, when Paul said he was a wretched man, he can't find the ability to do what he knows. The verbs around that are present tense. He's speaking about himself then. The awareness of our sins runs perpendicular to the awareness of God's love for us. An awareness that we need reminded of every day. And just as Paul continued through all of his letters, half of his letters were devoted to reminding his readers of the gospel and who they were in Christ.
Okay, that's a rather important element, a rather important point of Paul's teaching that you're emphasizing there. Okay, now that we've discussed this, the weakness that has and how that has often been ignored by modern Christians, especially, let's look at our sixth question. What are Paul's primary theological sources? That is, what formed him? These are debated sometimes. How much is it his Jewish background? How much did he have in terms of Greek philosophy and study? And what about his own visionary experiences, such as the experience on the road to Damascus? How do these play in giving us the Paul that we know?
Paul claims to have been taught by Gamaliel himself, and Gamaliel was known as the ultimate teacher of the law in the New Testament. His knowledge of law is prevalent through his writings because he understood the law so well. He knew the law could not produce that which it desired. Gamaliel's views possibly influenced Paul's comments on marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. Paul was the master teacher who could adjust to his audience. He may have developed his teaching skills after his favorite school teachers. We know that he learned his lessons on how to be a proper Pharisee so well it made him, by his own words, the ultimate Pharisee. In Acts 13, we know that not only could he knew Jewish history so well that he could show those he was talking to how Jewish history foreshadowed the coming of the Messiah. Acts 14 tells us that he knew the Greeks so well, he was familiar with their false idols. And he may have learned that not just from the Greeks, but maybe from a comparison religious study under Jewish teachings. Acts 23 reveals to us that he was knowledgeable enough in the different sects. He could redirect charges against them to the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He tells us that he was from a Jewish family trained in Jerusalem who knew both Hebrew and Aramaic. Growing up in a busy commerce center like Taurus, he knew the international language of Greek. Acts 21 reveals his different abilities with different languages. Not only did he know the language of the Greeks, but Acts 17 reveals that he knew the writers of Greek culture, which enabled him to move in between different writers so that he could connect with the Greek teachers. Acts 17 also reveals to us that he understands the different cultures of worship and philosophy of Greek. These things enabled him to move in between his teaching to both Greek and Hebrew. Also think his affinity for Timothy is because it is believed Paul may have been between the ages of 20 and 31 when he was converted. So maybe he saw in Timothy what he desired he would have learned as a young man in the Jewish schools. He realized that maybe a lot of his schooling just wasn't sufficient. All the knowledge that Paul gained enabled him to write the New Testament, and almost half of it. He was not a simple blue-collar fisherman. We know that when he was encountered him, Ananias. And we know through Ananias, the story of Paul, we know the fear that he created believers. Okay? And that shows us in Acts 9 how important the transformation of Paul's life was. Roman culture also probably affected Paul, that he knew what it was to be a soldier as he lived life with the best army in the world. He also saw the best athletes perform. And he tells us this in his writings to Timothy. Okay? We can also see that he was a hard man, hard enough to watch another get stoned and pursue those in view, insulting your view of God, to murder them. This had to be hardness developed in the schools and in the culture of growing up in Rome. So we know that life of Paul as a Roman citizen had hardened him. We knew that the overwhelming love of God overwhelmed him. He never forgot, and it formed his writings and teachings, that he had persecuted those he now had killed them, those he now stood with, as he tells the church of Corinth and the church of Ephesus that. So I think all these things, I think Paul, God, as he tells us in Paul's steps, so I think all those things add to what we know of Paul.
Okay, now I've got one of those interesting open-ended questions. Uh, what do you think, or what would Paul say to the American church in general?
Oh boy, this is a loaded one. You're asking the wrong person. I would think he would start off by saying, "You remind me of my Jewish brethren in Rome. They too sat on the outside, looking at others, judging how horrible sinners everyone is. And then I simply reminded them that they were no different than those they judged." What is with all this gossip, slander, and backbiting anyway? I mean, geez, haven't you noted that every letter I wrote, I talked about those sins in particular? Don't you know that the heart screams of those who struggle with knowing they are loved are found in the words of the slanderer and the gossiper? This thing y'all call social media. And remember what I said about Paul being familiar with other languages? He would be familiar with Southern culture too, so he'd know how Southerners talk. Okay? Don't you know, as a whole lot of my brothers and cis men on social media shows that a whole lot of my brothers and sisters are screaming that they don't believe God loves them. He does, really. Trust me, he really loves you. And he would tell them that Christ did not come to die on the cross in order to increase morality, make a moral society or a Christian nation, or to hand out steps on how to be a better Christian, or to utter some new form of obedience. We already had the most moral, obedient, religious, law-keeping individuals walking at the time Christ came. And he called them all whitewashed tombs, and told us we needed something greater. I'm currently in a book study. I think that's what Paul said, and I think Paul would also echo this sentiment. I'm currently in a book study that with a bunch of great guys titled Romance of Grace, written by Jim McNally III, in which the author proposes, what if the reason Christ came was to answer one question? What if God sees us the way a man does a beautiful woman? He's infatuated with her, and his main question is not how to make her more moral, but rather how to get her to fall in love with him. Of course, the natural outgrowth of falling in love is that your desire matches your will, and desiring to exhibit that to all through living a life that glorifies it. I think Paul echoes those sentiments in Ephesians 5. I also think he would tell them to stop separating over their differences because they're too messed up to be sure they are so right. Rather, he would encourage them to find commonality for being expressed living love together. That's my thoughts.
Well, the next question turns you toward your own tradition, stream, and denomination in general, and I'm tempted to change the question to, would the message be any different to your tradition stream than to the rest? But you can answer the.
I don't think it would be any different, and I'd probably expound a little more on what I just said when I would say, I think he would say, get over yourselves. You're not as obedient as you think you are. Stop trying to impress God. He's not impressed with your spiritual disciplines. Those you're looking at that have different sins than you do, like that drunk lying on the ground, may possess a greater awareness of God's love than you do. Just because you're trying to impress God with your faithful full obedience, and he's lying in a gutter, doesn't mean your hearts are any better or in better shape. Because you're lowering the low, you're oversimplifying your sin. Thus, you're not able to know your weakness fully. Remember that boasting in sin and weakness I said? You can't do it. Right? And this is hurting you. This is actually one of the key issues of the problem of this thing you call fundamentalism. Stop trying to get others to not act broken. They are, and so are you. Please stop lying to yourself when you tell others you don't love sin. If you didn't love sin, you wouldn't sin. Don't you know there's pleasure in sin? Stop lying to yourself. Okay? Get real with it. It's not about your getting better, your obedience, or you. It's about the one who every knee will bow to you. Or did you think God was praising your obedience? Yes, you'll get better. You'll finish what you started and finish. Wait, that's not right. I said that wrong. You didn't start it, did you? You're not going to finish it either. Stop telling people to hide their brokenness or perform better. My brother John was right. Those who are experiencing knowing their love walk into life with their brokenness. After all, whether you realize it or not, you're not doing a very good job of hiding yours. When you accept that you might discover that you are more loved than you ever knew, and the condition of your heart might improve, he would also tell them the same thing he told the Gentile believers in Galatia, as the American church is not a whole lot different. Who has bewitched you? Who has called you from the purity of the gospel? Was it that idiot Pat? I'll get up in his grill and I'll give him the knife to castrate himself. For you dearly beloved, stupid, empty-headed, mindless Americans, what in the world makes you think that the law or your obedience grants you greater favor, love, or anything else? Stupid, stupid, stupid. You're loved. He will finish it. Live loved. And as you do, you'll find others will notice your obedience. Notice I said others will notice your obedience. If you're noticing it, it may be your narcissistic nature crying out, notice me. Okay? I think that is what Paul would say. Now, Henry, I think you might want to pick up your phone right now and buzz there and tell her to push the button on the shock collar.
Oh, I'll probably go ahead and let you rip. It's always good in a video, you know. So let's go for the next question here, and I will tell you I don't know whether it gives you an advantage or a disadvantage, but nobody in the previous interviews was asked this question during the height of an election season.
Oh boy!
So nobody else has been put in quite that position. I plan another interview, and he'll probably have the problem of during election season. But the question is, what do you think Paul would say to us about our political activities?
This is an easy one for me, and one you might not agree with me on, Henry. I'm not sure. I think Paul would say two things. Do not be involved in the affairs of this world. After all, do you go into a foreign country and start worrying about their political activities as a visitor? Nonetheless, if God should put work in your hands that involves you being involved in politics, then do hearts awaken to the love of God as you grow in the knowledge of that love, so that you reveal His love to all as you labor to increase the morality of all mankind, not to increase that morality, but through, not for that purpose, that should never be our purpose, but to bring heaven to earth. Of course, as a secondary benefit of our labor to bring heaven to earth, the morality of all mankind might be increased, but we need to remember who the prince of this world is. On a personal note, I often see this point of how we are electing leaders who tanked morality. I see many Christians talking, well, we're electing leaders who don't have any morality. And I often wonder myself, as compared to what? Using Christians for street lamps, sleeping with your sister, throwing Christians to wild animals, owning slaves, drunken orgies, hanging with a pedophile, self-centered ambition, power-hungry, driven by selfish desires, being political puppets, warmongering, cooking the books. Oh, now we've got this thing, this Hamilton show. Oh, that Hamilton, what a ruse he was. Well, you need to read John Adams' thoughts on Hamilton. I often wonder what they're comparing it to. Hopefully not themselves, because the gospel tells us that we are all moral failures.
Okay. Let me give you the final question is like, take the shock collar off and go where you want to go. But it says, address the most important topic you see about Paul that's not covered with the questions. This is, what do you want to say about Paul that I didn't put on the list?
Right. The combination of Paul's study, I think I pretty much, let me state, I think you should have taken the shock collar off before question number 8, and before I read what I thought Paul would actually say to the church, especially my denomination. So, but since the shock, you didn't take the shock collar off then, why are you taking it off now? I've already said the hardest part. The combination of Paul's study before conversion and direct message he was given by God, made for a unique message that has been communicated in the church today. Thus, we have made the law something it wasn't intended to be, and the gospel sounds like an Eddie Money song. We have our ticket to paradise and our bags are packed. To think of it, the church of Thessalonica also thought that, and Eddie Money hadn't written this song yet. The law was never meant to be a standard upon which we force obedience upon others or measure such obedience with. That would place the law in the very position of producing that which Paul said he couldn't do in Galatians. There is a significant difference between being willing to obey and desiring to obey. The book I mentioned earlier talks a lot about the separation of our moral wills versus our stacked wills, what our hearts actually desire. Okay? And I think we have failed to understand the difference today. The difference is that one involves the heart, the other doesn't. For some reason, in our teachings, we've forgotten that behavioral-based teaching, morality-based teaching, and performance-based teaching does nothing to awaken the heart's desires and affections. Only the gospel does that. And God said over and over and over again, He wants our hearts. Any parent knows that telling our kids to do something often produces the opposite effect. The law can do one thing to the believer whose heart is not involved: set a target to shoot for and then shout at them for not making it. We hear the law in 1,000 different ways in the voices of significant others as it continues continually reminds us that we are not measuring up. The Christian who has a truncated view of the gospel needs to keep going back on Sunday morning for more lessons on how to be more capable, better, and to know they matter. Then they go out in the next week and experience failure all over again. It's a vicious cycle that has been going on since Genesis 3 that the majority of our pastors and teachers and leaders seem to have just picked up. We long to know we matter, to find our value, to be counted among those who belong among the capable ones. We surely don't want to be seen as incapable of living this Christian life. Therefore, such teaching appeals to us. But the law can't make us feel worthy or significant. And we can continue in search for those things. Therefore, it is only the gospel that can enable the heart to be matched with the will, so that they are joined in union. But a gospel that moves way beyond 1 Corinthians 15, all the way back to Genesis 3, and all the way forward to Revelation. A gospel that is found in every chapter of the Bible. A gospel that tells us that we are not the merchant who is to go searching for the rare pearl, or the one who buys the field and then labors to find the hidden treasure, but that we are the rare pearl, and we are the hidden treasure that Christ came in search of. We are not the best laborers, but we're the ones that are hoping nobody picks us, and then at the end of the day, we'll be able to slide in and get some pay just for showing up. This is the gospel Paul knew and preached, and the only gospel that ends our striving and searching for love in all the wrong places and all the wrong ways, enabling us to live from being loved rather than hoping or dreaming about love. Until we learn this, we will always think the Bible is about how to make us more moral, rather than a story that tells us how the Creator came in search of a beautiful bride. For some reason, we have decided there is a hard gospel and a soft gospel. What it's meant when we talk about the gospel being hard or soft is whether we bring them along with it or not. In fact, my pastor Brian, who I mentioned earlier, has been accused of the very thing. I've spent the last 4 months feeling like Paul, as I've been attacked for not teaching obedience. This is what happens when we mix the law with the gospel. And doing so, we wrong both their distinctiveness and their power. Now, here's the unique thing that happens when we keep the law and the gospel distinct from one another. We end up growing in the knowledge of both, along with growing in the knowledge of God's love. And this is why Paul prayed those at Ephesus would grow in that knowledge of God's love. And then we realize when we do that, we realize that the law takes on a new job, as it serves as a guide and how to express that we know we're loved to others. We desire to worship better, love sweeter. Otherwise, as Paul said, we run the risk that our faithful obedience is worthless and is not motive or heart of love. 1 Corinthians 13. Every single law is a slice of the big pie of love God and love others. Yet only the gospel repeated every day can print that upon us. That's why Romans 12 doesn't precede Romans 7. Romans 8 precedes Romans 7. You know, I recently learned that I'm not as capable as Paul in a recent Romans class. Thought I'd already know that, but I guess God already had to remind me of it. Paul made it to chapter 6 before he knew his readers would be asking about Paul and obedience. I couldn't even get into chapter 5 before someone asked me about obedience. The American church is fascinated with the law of morality and obedience, the gospel of betterment and performance. I was reminded of this recently when I heard a sermon on the life of Judas and how he was a pretty moral dude. The one delivering the message actually said, we are pretty good people. We have one or two things wrong with us. Yeah, I keep hearing that, and I keep hoping somebody would tell me the one verse that says we're good people. Okay? The sad part of this is that that is the sentiment of the American church, for the most part. Most Christians believe we're basically good that just needed a way to heaven, needed a way to get to God, and Christ provided that. But that's not the gospel. Okay? The gospel is we are moral failures. The problem is we began defining goodness by the same way those outside the church do, our sense of morality. If we're basically moral people, then it's presumed we're good. And if we're not, well, and again, that's not the gospel. The gospel is no one seeks God. We seek our own good. We all serve our own pleasures, and we all serve the prince of this world. Those are Paul's words, not mine. All fall way short. Then the speaker went on to say how Satan whispers a thought into our mind and we act on it. This also is not the words of Paul. There is a reason Paul kept telling us that we need to recognize the flesh is dead and that there is a raging war between the flesh and the spirit going on. We don't need Satan whispering in our ears. We have enough within us to deal with. We don't need his help. Paul was deeply passionate about the gospel of grace and law, as it shows us how to express the obedience that comes from living large as the excellent ones of God and his beloved. The problem is most of us have lived our entire lives for good grades, a good report, good friends, a good wife and family, for the pleasure of our family, and good jobs. Now we think we're to live for the love and pleasure of God. Again, that wouldn't have been the message of Paul, and it's not the message of the gospel. Now we're to live the message of the gospel, and Paul's message was that we are to live knowing that we are the cherished bride and express such in worshipful obedience. Those verses that talk about pleasing God are law-based verses that continually should push us to realize we can't, and to be extremely grateful for being given the righteousness of the one who could, and then realizing the law serves now as our guide, showing us how to express that righteousness and holiness. We can't produce holiness, but we can express it. This is what Paul meant when he said, work out your salvation, and that his chief desire was to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. That's it.
Well, thank you, Pat. I think that's wonderful. At this point, we'll display a link to World Prayer where you can find out more about Pat and the ministry. And Pat, thank you very much for your time.